She entered the chamber with a grace that made the air itself pause. The soldiers at the door straightened as if some old instinct had commanded them to. Her silver skin shimmered like starlight, her long white hair flowed behind her in a faint wave, and her eyes, strange and luminous, seemed to look not at the room but through it. She was not just another diplomat from another world. She was the princess of the Arthalan Empire, the daughter of the most feared ruler in the Galactic Council. Across the massive chamber, the human representative stood alone, surrounded by alien ambassadors who whispered quietly, their words sharp with distrust. Humanity had only joined the Council 5 years ago, and already it had shaken the balance of power. The Council thought they understood humans, primitive, ambitious, a species that climbed too fast. But none of them expected her to be curious. None of them expected her to step down from her marble throne and walk straight toward the lone human officer standing at the center of the hall. For the first few minutes, no one moved. No one breathed. She stopped close enough that the air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Her voice was soft, melodic, almost disarming. "Human," she whispered, tilting her head slightly as if she were examining something rare and dangerous. "What is between your legs?" The hall erupted with gasps. Several ambassadors stood from their seats. Her guards stiffened, their hands on their weapons. But the princess didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on the human with an almost childish curiosity that didn't match the raw power in her presence. The human officer, a man who had faced war, fire, and alien fleets without blinking, suddenly found no words at all. That single question was not about anatomy. In her culture, it meant something far more dangerous, an inquiry of courage, strength, and legacy. The human stared back, heartbeat steady, though the weight of 100 alien eyes pressed down on him. His silence stretched through the chamber like a held breath. And then, slowly, he took a single step closer. Every guard raised their weapons. He didn't stop. He simply looked her straight in the eyes and answered in a calm, unwavering voice. "Humanity," he said. "That's what's between us." His words fell like iron. Not loud, not shouted, but heavy, like a stone dropped into deep water. The chamber fell silent. Even the air seemed to grow colder. The princess tilted her head back, and for a brief second, a flicker of something crossed her face, not offense, but interest. What no one in that chamber knew was that her question had not been personal. It had been a test. A ritual her people had used for thousands of years to measure the strength of rulers and warriors. To ask someone what is between your legs in Arthalan culture meant, what gives you the right to stand before us? For centuries, the answer had been predictable: power, empire, bloodline. But humans were never predictable. And that answer, humanity, spread through the council chamber like fire through dry grass. It was bold. It was reckless. And it changed everything. The princess didn't step back. Instead, she turned her gaze away from him and toward the council. "He answered," she said, her voice echoing in the vast chamber. "And he did not flinch." Her people valued courage above all else, and that single act shifted the balance in ways the council hadn't expected. 4 years, the Arthalan Empire had been a neutral power, sitting above the petty rivalries of the council, neither ally nor enemy. But that moment planted a seed. Because courage to her people was more than strength, it was worth following. And in that moment, humanity had caught the eye of the most powerful empire in the galaxy. Behind the beauty and ceremony of the princess lay a secret. She was not simply curious about humans. She was watching them. The Arthalan had seen what humanity could do in silence. How it had risen from nothing, how it had survived invasions, how it had spoken once and made empires listen. Now the galaxy stood on the edge of a storm. The council had grown used to controlling humanity through treaties and pressure, treating them as a pawn in their endless power games. But the princess saw something different, a species that didn't bow, a people who carried something far more dangerous than fleets or armies: belief in themselves. Over the next few weeks, she began to visit the human envoy more frequently. Her guards followed her everywhere, whispering their objections, but she ignored them. She wanted to understand the humans up close. She asked questions no alien had ever dared to ask. Why do your people fight even when you cannot win? Why do you keep walking toward danger? Why does death not frighten you the way it frightens us? Every answer he gave unsettled her in ways she couldn't admit. Humans didn't fight for power like the other species. They fought because they refused to be erased. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the council, powerful voices began to rise. Other empires saw the princess's interest in humanity as a threat. Whispers turned into plots. They remembered how humanity had once brought down fleets with ruthless precision, how their soldiers had walked through fire and laughed in the face of fear. They feared that if the Arthalan Empire sided with humanity, no one would be able to stop them. Old alliances began to fracture. Treaties that had lasted centuries cracked under the weight of silent dread. The galaxy had no room for two great powers standing together. The princess, torn between her people's expectations and her own growing fascination, made a choice that would change everything. During a council meeting where humanity was accused of expanding too far, where the council demanded that the humans surrender their fleets, she stood up. The room froze. No one had ever seen her take sides before. She looked at the humans, not just the envoy, but the entire delegation, and said, "If you demand their surrender, then you demand mine as well." Her voice was soft, but it struck like thunder. In one sentence, she aligned the Arthalan Empire with humanity. The council erupted. Threats flew like shards of glass. Armies moved in the shadows. War plans, once buried, were dusted off. The galaxy had spent decades trying to control Earth. Now Earth had gained a protector, a princess whose name carried the weight of 1,000 fleets. The council's response was predictable. If they could not control humanity, they would destroy it. As fleets gathered in the cold void of space, humanity stood ready. The Terran fleets were not the largest, but they were the most disciplined. Every soldier carried history like a weapon. They had not forgotten how the galaxy treated them. This time, they would not fight alone. Arthalan warships, bright and elegant like silver blades, joined the black iron of the Terran armada. The galaxy had never seen such an alliance. For the first time, fear shifted away from Earth and turned toward the council itself. The first clash was silent. Then, like a storm breaking over a calm sea, war ripped through the stars. Council's fleets, once considered unstoppable, found themselves facing something they couldn't calculate. Human defiance mixed with Arthalan precision. Where one side brought fire, the other brought resolve. Battles that were supposed to last weeks ended in hours. The council's defenses, built over centuries, cracked under the weight of a single alliance. Humanity and the princess stood at the center of it all, two forces that the galaxy had underestimated for too long. On the bridge of her flagship, the princess stood beside the human officer she had once questioned. Her eyes burned with the reflection of war, fleets colliding, worlds shaking. She remembered the moment she asked him that question, the way he answered without fear. Now, she understood what was between humanity's legs. It wasn't flesh. It wasn't steel. It was something far more terrifying, the will to never kneel. When the council finally fell silent, when their last fleet crumbled like dust, the princess turned to the human officer and spoke softly, "You were never the weak ones." He smiled faintly, his uniform burned and scarred, but his voice steady. "We never were." And so, the galaxy changed. The council that had once ruled everything now answered to those they had tried to control. Humanity stood not as a servant but as a power in its own right, and beside them stood the princess who had seen their strength before anyone else dared to. One question had changed everything. One moment of curiosity had set a fire that burned across the stars. If you enjoyed this HFY sci-fi story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more cinematic tales of humanity's rise among the stars. Your support helps bring these stories to life, and remember, in the vast silence of space, sometimes one question can start a war. The council chamber that once stood as a symbol of galactic unity had turned into a storm of fear and whispering voices. Rumors about the Arthalan princess's words to the human officer spread like wildfire, twisting through every hall and station like an electric current. Every species in the chamber knew exactly what that question meant. It was not an insult. It was not flirtation. It was a test. A test no outsider had ever been allowed to pass. For thousands of years, her people had used it only on leaders, warriors, and rulers who stood at the edge of history. The fact that she asked it to a human wasn't just strange, it was unthinkable. By their traditions, to ask someone what is between your legs was to demand their essence, their claim to stand as equals or challengers to empires. And the human's answer had burned through the room like a blade: humanity. While alien ambassadors panicked in whispered clusters, the princess walked away from the chamber with that word echoing in her mind. Humanity. No one had ever answered like that. The council expected bloodlines, power, wealth, armies. But the human had given her something far more dangerous than power: conviction. It was the one thing the council feared most. In a galaxy built on fear and control, conviction could burn empires. Behind closed doors, alien diplomats argued like cornered animals. "She can't be serious," hissed a scaled ambassador, his claws scraping the marble table. "An Arthalan choosing a human as worthy." A feathered diplomat struck the table with her talons. "If she acknowledges him, it's not just him. It's all of them. Do you understand what that means? If she chooses to stand with the humans, the balance will collapse. The council won't control anything anymore." The council speaker, an ancient being of blue light, hovered above the others, its voice low and cold. "Then we make sure it never happens." Across the galaxy, news of the princess's question spread like ripples through water. On mining stations orbiting dead stars, workers whispered the story over cheap drinks. On alien warships, soldiers passed it around like a secret too powerful to keep. On Earth, it was replayed across every channel, dissected in every briefing room. It wasn't just gossip, it was history in motion. And the Terran fleet commanders knew exactly what it meant. The Arthalan Empire had stayed neutral through every war the Council ever fought. If their princess showed even a shadow of favor toward humanity, it would be enough to tilt the stars themselves. The princess found herself alone in her private chamber, the walls humming with quiet light. She stared out at the stars, the distant blue of Earth among them. No one knew what she thought in that moment. But behind her calm expression, her mind raced. For her entire life, she had watched council members treat humans as reckless children, as dangerous animals who rose too quickly. Yet in their eyes, she had seen something they couldn't name: fear. Humanity didn't play by the galaxy's rules. They rewrote them. They didn't rise because they were given power. They rose because no one could stop them. Her guards entered quietly. One of them, an older warrior with lines etched into his silver skin, bowed low. "Your Highness," he said, his voice steady, "your question has caused storms in the council. Many believe you shamed them. Many believe you challenged their power." She didn't turn from the stars. "Good," she said softly. "It's time someone did." Meanwhile, deep within Earth's military command, the human officer who had stood before her stood now in a different kind of silence, the silence of power waking up. Generals and admirals surrounded a massive holomap of council space, their faces hard but their eyes gleaming with something dangerous. The princess's question was more than curiosity, it was an opening. "They are watching us now," the admiral said, tapping the glowing map. "All of them. The princess has shifted the board without firing a single shot. The council will panic. And panic makes empires bleed." Back at the council, fear turned into action. In the lower chambers, a group of old powers gathered in secret. Representatives from empires that had crushed rebellions, burned worlds, and ruled through fear. They whispered of assassination, sabotage, quiet removal. "If she allies with them, our power ends," one rasped, his voice dripping venom. "She's a threat to the old order." Another leaned forward, reptilian eyes narrowing. "Then she won't live to choose." But the Arthalan princess was not as naive as they thought. She had seen their politics for centuries. She had walked their golden halls knowing every word spoken to her was a mask. And for the first time, she saw something worth breaking their perfect little galaxy for. A single human who stood alone against the storm and didn't blink. 2 nights later, she appeared at the human embassy unannounced, walking past guards who didn't even dare to breathe too loudly in her presence. The officer who had answered her question stood there, still confused by the weight of what had happened, still unaware of how fast the galaxy had begun to move around him. She approached slowly, her movements deliberate, her eyes burning with quiet fire. "Do you know what you've done?" she asked him softly. He shook his head. "You didn't just answer a question," she said. "You declared war on a way of life that has ruled the stars for centuries." He looked at her without fear, the same way he had in the council chamber. "We've faced worse," he said simply. Something in her shifted when she heard that. For the first time in her life, she saw someone who didn't flinch before power. Someone who didn't care who she was, or what empire she carried on her back. She saw humanity, not as a threat, but as something terrifyingly free. Outside those walls, the galaxy was already choosing sides. Old allies whispered. Empires prepared fleets. The council began to tighten its grip on everything it controlled, desperate to keep the old world intact. But no one could stop the question she had asked. It had been like a match falling into dry forest. And now, everything was burning. The princess turned back to the window, her voice low. "They'll come for me," she said. "They'll try to silence me before I choose." The humans stepped forward. "Then they'll have to go through us." In that moment, a spark lit between them, not romantic, but dangerous, sharp, made of defiance. A bond born not from love, but from the shared understanding of what it means to stand against the entire galaxy. The princess, daughter of the most powerful empire, and a single human officer had no idea how far that one question would go. But the galaxy was about to find out. And the council, which had ruled for centuries through fear and control, would soon face something it could never control. Humanity and a princess who dared to stand beside them. In the days following the princess's quiet visit to the human embassy, the galaxy seemed to shift beneath everyone's feet. The moment her question had left her lips, the old world had cracked, and now the cracks were widening. Entire fleets moved without announcements, trade routes pulsed with uneasy silence, and the council chambers, once symbols of control, buzzed like a nest of frightened insects. Every species in the galaxy knew what the question meant in Arthalan culture. It was not flirtation. It was a declaration, a way of saying you are not beneath me. And the princess, the most untouchable figure in the galaxy, had said those words to a human. Not an emperor. Not an admiral. A single human officer standing alone in a hall full of predators. While the council scrambled, she returned to her star palace aboard the Arthalan flagship, high above the council world. But something inside her had changed. For years she had lived as the perfect heir, silent, calculating, wrapped in diplomatic language and ceremonial armor. But humanity had shaken that. That man's steady eyes, his refusal to cower or grasp for power, the simplicity of his answer, humanity, cut through the cold steel of her upbringing. She found herself thinking about it when the stars were quiet. Her advisors noticed. "Your Highness," one of her ministers whispered nervously, "your actions have awakened the council. They are moving fleets. They are preparing for war." Your words were not seen as a curiosity. They were seen as a spark. She knew. Of course she knew. The council didn't fear Earth's fleets. They feared Earth's will. They feared the idea of humans inspiring others. If the Arthalan Empire ever stood beside humanity, no alliance could match their combined strength. It wouldn't just tilt the balance. It would shatter it. And yet, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, excitement. For centuries, her empire had played the role of careful spectators, powerful but neutral, sitting high above the blood and mud of galactic politics. But neutrality was its own kind of cage. Down on the surface of the council world, the humans were already feeling the shift. Their small embassy, once ignored by most, now found itself surrounded by watchers. Spies disguised as merchants, agents hidden in shadows, ships scanning every corner of the Terran sector. Humanity was used to being underestimated, and they used it like a blade. While the galaxy's diplomats panicked, Earth's military command was already building maps, watching fleet movements, decoding transmissions. They knew a storm was forming. But unlike the others, they weren't afraid. Storms were familiar to humans. In secret chambers beneath the council, the old powers gathered, the same ones who had burned worlds in the past to keep their thrones. They didn't speak of peace. They spoke of control. If the princess stands with them, hissed a scaled lord, our fleets will burn. She must be silenced before she chooses, another agreed, his golden mask gleaming in the dim light. And if not silenced, then replaced. They were planning not just the end of a princess but the destruction of a species they could no longer control. But they underestimated her. She had known their intentions the moment she left the council hall. Arthalan rulers were raised among snakes. She'd always worn their venom like perfume. What they didn't understand was that, for the first time, she was no longer playing for them. She had seen something worth breaking her empire's silence for. She didn't trust the council. But strangely, she trusted the humans, not their power, not their fleets, but the raw certainty behind their words. The human officer she'd tested became the quiet center of the storm. He had not asked for power. He didn't even fully understand the magnitude of what had happened. But wherever he walked, alien diplomats followed with curious, fearful eyes. Soldiers who once mocked humanity now watched him with a kind of unease, as if something invisible had wrapped itself around his name. He didn't act like a savior. He acted like a soldier. Calm, direct, unapologetically human. And that was exactly what terrified the council most. One evening, far away from the noise of the chamber, she requested another meeting with him. No guards, no audience, just a hidden garden aboard her starship, where silver trees grew under artificial stars. She walked slowly toward him, her long cloak trailing across the grass, her luminous eyes softer than they had been in the chamber. "You don't understand what you've done," she said quietly. He didn't answer. She stepped closer, her voice lower. "You spoke one word. Humanity. And now every empire in this galaxy is trying to decide whether to fear you or follow you." He exhaled, his voice calm, almost tired. "I didn't come here to start a war." Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "That's what makes it worse. They can't control someone who doesn't want their throne." She turned away and looked at the stars outside the glass dome. "You've changed the shape of the galaxy, human. You didn't even raise a blade." Meanwhile, outside, ships moved in the dark. Council fleets began to tighten their patrols. The Arthalan court received messages demanding the princess renounce her words and condemn humanity. She burned them without reply. Her father, the emperor, watched in silence, curious whether his daughter was a threat or a savior. And among the common people, the merchants, the soldiers, the workers on distant worlds, stories spread of the princess who had tested a human and found him worthy. The council, sensing their control slipping, prepared their knives in the shadows. The princess, standing under the artificial stars, already knew they were coming. She also knew she wouldn't stand alone. For the first time in her life, she was not just a symbol. She was a spark. And the galaxy was already catching fire. The night the first fleet moved, the galaxy held its breath. Above the glittering council world, countless ships began to gather like vultures circling a wounded prey. They weren't officially at war, not yet, but the weight in the air was unmistakable. Patrols grew sharper, messages grew colder, and whispers in diplomatic halls turned to hard, measured silence. Every eye in the galaxy turned toward the Arthalan princess, the one whose single question had shattered centuries of carefully built control. And they turned toward the humans, that unpredictable species who had answered it with a word that couldn't be crushed: humanity. In the deep black of space, far from the shining cities of the council, humanity's fleet stirred in silence. The Terran Armada was not the largest in the galaxy, but it had something no other fleet had: discipline carved from centuries of survival. Black warships, sleek and silent, drifted in formation like the shadow of a storm waiting to fall. Every captain aboard those vessels understood what was happening. They hadn't asked for this war, but wars had always had a way of finding humanity. They didn't fight because they loved it. They fought because they refused to kneel. The council made its first move not with a declaration, but with an accident. A small Terran scout convoy was intercepted at the border of Council-controlled space. The official reports called it a misunderstanding. The charred hulls of the human ships said otherwise. The message was clear. This was no longer politics. This was the beginning. When the human response came, it wasn't loud. It wasn't a threat. It was silence. And that silence rippled like a cold wind through every system. In the Arthalan palace, the princess stood on her private balcony, staring at the stars with a heavy heart. She knew this was what the council wanted. A war not fought in chambers, but in the black between stars. A war that would isolate humanity before her empire could choose sides. Her advisors begged her to stay neutral. Let the humans burn themselves out, one of them pleaded. You cannot risk your throne for a species that has already made enemies of everyone. She turned, her gaze sharp enough to cut. No, she said. They didn't make enemies. The council did when they tried to own them. The council wasn't subtle. It began to build a coalition fleet under the banner of restoring order. Worlds that once ignored human existence now found themselves signing secret agreements to attack them. Merchant guilds froze Terran trade lines. Political mouths twisted the truth in broadcast after broadcast, painting humanity as aggressors, as dangerous, as wild animals that needed to be tamed before they tore the galaxy apart. But beneath all those words, they feared something simple. If the humans and the Arthalan ever stood together, no wall could stop them. Humanity didn't flinch. Their admirals gathered in the underground war room on Earth, a chamber older than most of the current council species. Holographic stars burned across the table as battle plans were drawn with quiet precision. They didn't speak of begging or treaties. They spoke of what humans always spoke of when pushed: how to make their enemies regret the day they raised a hand against them. Every soldier on every Terran ship knew their history. They were the children of a world that never gave up, a world that had been broken and rebuilt more times than anyone could count. The galaxy thought they could corner them. They didn't understand they had just trapped themselves. While the council gathered its fleets, the princess made her choice. Late in the night, she slipped into her father's throne chamber. The emperor, an ancient figure whose power had shaped centuries, sat in silence. He didn't turn to look at her. He already knew why she was there. They will come for me if I stand with them, she said. His voice was calm, like someone watching a storm gather. They already have. She hesitated, then spoke the words that would shake the galaxy. Then let them come. In that moment, the Arthalan Empire shifted. They didn't broadcast it. They didn't declare it. But when the first council fleet approached the Terran border, they found Arthalan ships waiting beside the Black Terran warships. The council commanders froze. This wasn't supposed to happen. The princess had defied them all. The most powerful neutral power in the galaxy had chosen to stand with the humans. Panic spread through the council like wildfire. Commanders barked at each other through encrypted channels. Diplomats screamed into open comms, and political leaders scrambled to rewrite their strategies. This was no longer a cornering. This was a standoff. And in the cold vacuum between the two forces, the humans did what they did best. They stared into the face of a storm and didn't blink. On the Terran flagship, the human officer who had started it all stood on the bridge, watching the stars darken as the council's armada approached. Behind him, screens flickered with sensor data and tactical overlays. Around him, his crew moved in perfect, practiced rhythm. No one shouted. No one panicked. They'd trained for this 1,000 times, even if they hadn't expected it to happen quite like this. A faint smile crossed his lips as the enemy ships appeared on the horizon. They didn't know it yet, but the galaxy had already chosen sides. Above him, on the Arthalan flagship, the princess stood at the command dais, dressed not in ceremonial robes but in the battle armor of her ancestors. For centuries, her people had remained untouchable observers. Tonight, they were part of history. As her fleet aligned with the Terrans, she whispered something only the stars could hear. Let them see what happens when you ask a question you're not ready to hear the answer to. The council fleet sent a final warning: stand down, surrender, return to the old order. Neither the humans nor the Arthalan responded. There was no room for compromise anymore. The black void between fleets grew heavier with every heartbeat, the silence sharper than any weapon. And then, like all wars that began with pride and fear, it started. The first shot came from the Council side. A single blue beam tore through the darkness like a spear. It struck nothing, because the Terrans were already moving. Their ships slipped through space like knives through water, their counterfire silent, precise, devastating. Arthalan warships followed, weaving silver light between black steel. The Council commanders expected chaos. What they got was a storm of terrifying coordination. Fleets they had once called barbaric moved with a grace their armies had never achieved. The battle was no longer about power. It was about truth. And in that truth, the galaxy saw something it had long forgotten. Humanity doesn't ask for permission to exist. They fight. And when they do, they don't fight alone. The first clash was not just a battle. It was a storm ripping through the galaxy. Council fleets, forged from centuries of arrogance, moved like great beasts expecting the galaxy to tremble before them. But the humans didn't tremble. They struck with a precision that felt surgical, their ships weaving through the dark void like predators that had been born in the night. The Council commanders expected brute force, messy fire, desperation. Instead, they met silence, coordination, and a level of control that their grand armadas couldn't match. Every move humanity made felt like it had already been rehearsed 1,000 times. Because it had. The Terran fleet wasn't improvising. It was executing a plan forged in years of preparation, discipline, and hard lessons carved into their history. The Arthalan fleet joined the fight not as hesitant allies but as equals. Their elegant silver ships glided alongside the black steel of the Terran armada, their energy weapons cutting through Council shields like thin paper. Together, they formed a tide the Council had never faced before, a seamless blend of brute human resilience and Arthalan precision. For centuries, the Council's greatest strength had been division. They pitted empires against each other, ensuring no alliance could ever threaten their throne. But now, two of the galaxy's most unpredictable forces stood shoulder to shoulder. That was something no Council fleet was built to handle. On the Council flagship, panic spread behind polished walls. Admirals shouted conflicting orders, trying to rally their scattered ships, but their carefully structured hierarchy fractured the moment they realized they were losing. "They're everywhere," a voice screamed over the comms. "We can't track them. They're inside our formation." Their enemies weren't just attacking. They were inside the lines before the Council could even respond. Human corvettes tore through support vessels, slicing supply chains in half, while Arthalan warships methodically dismantled their heaviest cruisers. The princess stood tall on her flagship's command deck, eyes glowing faintly in the light of tactical displays. Her voice was calm, clear, unwavering. "Push through the eastern flank," she ordered. "Let the Terrans handle the core." Her captains obeyed without hesitation. This wasn't politics anymore. This was war. And the Arthalan had chosen their side. For the first time in living memory, their shimmering ships dove into the heart of battle not to observe, not to dictate, but to fight. On the Terran flagship, the human officer who had started it all stood at the center of the bridge. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. His crew knew every movement, every signal. They trusted him the way humanity had learned to trust itself, in the fires of survival. "Drop shields," he said, and the crew obeyed without a heartbeat of hesitation. Full burn. Straight through their center. The admiral watching from the Council side couldn't believe what she saw. "They're dropping shields," she hissed. "They've lost their minds." But what looked like madness was human strategy. They surged through the battlefield like a spear, their formation punching directly into the center of the Council fleet where their coordination was weakest. The Council forces tried to respond, but every counterattack fell apart. Their fleets were massive but fragile, built on the assumption that no enemy would ever dare to face them head-on. Humanity didn't just face them. Humanity carved them apart. Arthalan warships swept in behind the human spearhead, sealing off escape routes. Entire Council squadrons vanished from scanners in minutes, their glowing hulls torn open by coordinated strikes. The Council's perfect war machine, untouched for centuries, crumbled under pressure it had never been built to withstand. Back in the council chamber on the surface, politicians and rulers stared at the battle reports in horror. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Humanity was supposed to be crushed quickly, quietly, before the princess's words turned into rebellion. Instead, it was their fleets that burned. Their fortress of control, their carefully maintained illusion of invincibility, was being peeled apart piece by the very species they thought would always kneel. How can they fight like this? One ambassador cried out, but there was no answer. Because deep down, they already knew. Humanity didn't fight to win glory. They fought to survive. And no one, no matter how powerful, fought harder than those who had nothing to lose. The tide of the battle turned fully when the Terran fleet reached the Council's command ship. It was a vessel so large it cast shadows over entire squadrons, a symbol of the Council's power. No one had ever breached it. No one had ever even gotten close. The humans didn't hesitate. Their fighters swarmed it like hornets, carving a path straight to its heart. Inside the ship, alarms screamed as the impossible unfolded. Terran drop pods slammed into the hull, cutting their way through corridors where no enemy had ever walked. The Council soldiers inside were trained to enforce power, not fight for it. They broke like brittle glass against soldiers who had been hardened by centuries of blood and struggle. The princess's fleet moved to block reinforcements, sealing the Council flagship in a cage of silver light. She watched calmly as the massive vessel that had once made the galaxy tremble fell apart piece by piece. "This is the price of underestimating them," she whispered to no one in particular. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. She knew the weight of what they had done. Empires don't just fall quietly. They shatter. Inside the flagship's command core, the human officer and his squad stood over the Council commander, the one who had signed the order to strike first. The alien's voice shook with disbelief. "This is impossible. You're humans. You shouldn't be able to." The officer cut him off, voice calm, cold, almost quiet. "That's the problem with people like you. You always think what we shouldn't be able to do matters more than what we will do." Moments later, the Council flagship fell silent. And when it did, the entire battlefield changed. Council fleets began to break apart, commanders fleeing or surrendering as the weight of their empire crumbled around them. Some tried to fight to the last, but against the combined human and Arthalian fleets, it was like throwing sand against a hurricane. The galaxy watched through fractured broadcasts and intercepted transmissions. For centuries, the Council had been the unshakable center of power. Now it was bleeding. The princess's voice rang out through encrypted channels, soft but sharp. "The old order is over." And everyone, from the richest world to the most distant mining rock, knew she was right. For humanity, it wasn't victory born from glory. It was survival forged into something stronger than fear. For the Council, it wasn't just defeat. It was a reckoning. The storm they thought they could control had turned on them, and now there was no place left to hide. And as the broken Council fleet drifted among the stars, one truth hung in the void like iron. You don't ask humanity to kneel. Not and expect to keep your throne. The battle that followed was not loud like the galaxy's old wars. It was quiet in a way that made every heartbeat echo through the void. The Council fleets, once proud and unshakable, now floated like broken titans across the stars. Where once they cast shadows over entire sectors, now those shadows were replaced by the black silhouettes of Terran warships and the silver arcs of Arthalian cruisers. The old order had collapsed, not with ceremony, not with speeches, but with a precision strike that no one could stop. The galaxy, long ruled by fear, finally witnessed something it never thought possible: the fall of the Council. Aboard the flagship of the Terran Armada, the human officer who had stood in the Council hall and answered the princess's question stared at the tactical map glowing softly before him. Entire fleets had folded. Strongholds that once seemed eternal now lay in ruin. Transmission after transmission poured in, some offering surrender, others begging for mercy. He didn't smile. There was no joy in this. Humanity hadn't come to build an empire of gold. Humanity had come because it had no choice. If they didn't rise, they would have been crushed beneath the same hands that had ruled over the stars for centuries. Far away on the Arthalan flagship, the princess stood alone at the edge of the observation deck. The stars stretched before her like an ocean without end, and below those stars lay the broken fleets of the Council. Her empire had remained neutral for centuries, untouched by the chaos of smaller wars. But neutrality had never felt like peace. It had always been a gilded cage. When she asked that question to a single human, she hadn't imagined how far the ripples would travel. But now, as she looked at the silent wreckage of the Council's power, she understood something deeper. She hadn't started this war. She had simply unlocked what was already waiting to happen. Across the galaxy, the broadcasts began. Millions of worlds tuned in as Council strongholds fell one after another. The rulers of the old order hid behind broken shields, while common people, miners, traders, wanderers, watched the symbol of fear burn. The Terrans didn't broadcast speeches of dominance. They didn't announce their victory with roaring declarations. They said nothing. And in that silence, the galaxy heard the truth. Humanity didn't need to scream to be heard. Their presence was enough. On the Council's capital world, once considered the most fortified place in the galaxy, the last remaining defenders stood behind flickering shields. These were the same leaders who had mocked Earth, who had smiled while whispering about controlling primitive humans. Now they trembled inside their shining towers as Terran dropships cut through the atmosphere like falling stars. The princess led her fleet into orbit, her ships casting silver light over the shattered skyline. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the Council's great fortress kneeled before someone else. The human officer stepped onto the surface of that world with quiet steps. No banners flew. No anthem played. Terran soldiers marched behind him, not conquerors, not tyrants, but people who had learned the hard way that survival often came at a price. At the great marble steps of the Council Tower, alien rulers waited, their faces pale, their arrogance stripped away like ash in the wind. They spoke first, their words shaky, trying to cling to the remnants of their dignity. "We can negotiate," one said. "We can share power," another added. But he only looked at them with the same calm expression he'd worn when the princess had tested him. Humanity had nothing to negotiate. The princess walked to his side. In that moment, the galaxy saw something it had never seen before. A Terran standing shoulder to shoulder with an Arthalan royal. She turned to the Council and spoke, her voice soft but sharp as a blade. "For centuries, you ruled by fear. For centuries, you believed no one could stand against you. Now, your fear belongs to someone else. Now, you answer to the people you tried to break." Around the galaxy, planets that had once bowed to the Council watched the transmission with silent awe. No one had ever spoken to the rulers like this. No one had ever dared. That single sentence cracked what was left of their power. Some worlds began to rise up without even being asked. Garrison commanders abandoned their posts. Entire fleets switched allegiances overnight, unwilling to fight for a regime that had just proven itself weak. Back in the chamber where the war had begun, the Council speaker knelt. This being, older than many civilizations, had never bowed to anyone in its long life. But now, it lowered itself to the floor as human boots echoed through the hall. "What will you do to us?" it whispered. The human officer looked at it without rage, without pity. "We'll do what you never could," he said quietly. "We'll let the galaxy breathe." The war was over, but the silence afterward was heavier than the noise. Rebuilding an entire galaxy from the ruins of an empire was not the work of tyrants. It was the work of those who remembered what it felt like to be crushed. The humans didn't claim the Council's throne. They dismantled it. They tore apart the chains that bound worlds and gave them the one thing no empire ever had before: choice. The princess stood beside him as the dawn rose over a world that had never seen one without the Council's shadow. She glanced at him, the human who had changed everything with a single word. "You didn't conquer them," she said softly. "You undid them." His eyes remained on the horizon. "They were already undone," he replied. "They just didn't know it yet." In the weeks that followed, new alliances formed. Old empires crumbled into dust. But one truth remained unshaken across the stars. When Earth stands, it does not stand alone anymore. The Arthalan princess and the humans had rewritten the galaxy's story, not with crowns, not with scepters, but with defiance and a shared refusal to kneel. The galaxy would tell this story for centuries. How it began with a single question. How the Council thought it owned the stars. How humanity whispered back, no. If you enjoyed this HFY sci-fi story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more epic cinematic tales of humanity's rise among the stars. Your support helps bring these stories to life, and remember, in the silence of space, one voice can ignite a storm.